In this video we will describe and illustrate how a time-lapse video of A380 arriving at Sydney Airport is shot and processed. We will look at equipment, camera settings, using the Holy Grail time-lapse technique to shoot dynamic day-night transitions and processing the time-lapse sequence using the LR time-lapse application. In order to successfully photograph time-lapse sequences you will need a very stable, heavy tripod if you have to manually make camera adjustments to aperture, shutter speed and ISO by hand. This old tripod is ideal for this application. If you are able to use a mobile device app like QDSLR dashboard or something similar, you can use a lighter carbon fiber tripod like this Benro example. This app requires a tethering cable for the GH4 I used. I have a new tethering cable on order and therefore had to adjust my camera by hand, which is not ideal. Whichever tripod you elect to use, a leveling head or ball head, that sits between your camera and the tripod head, is required to level your camera. The reason for this is to keep the horizon level and to ensure that any vertical lines in the image remain vertical and do not converge, as you can see in this image from the time-lapse sequence. Note that the aspect ratio of the original time-lapse sequence image is 4:3. Long before you arrive on location, set your camera up for time-lapse photography. I used a Panasonic GH4 that has a built-in time-lapse function. If your camera does not have a built-in time-lapse function, you will need to purchase something like this Velo Shutter Boss to enable precise interval shooting. Set the aspect ratio as 4:3. This will provide you with a variety of options of how to frame or crop your final rendered video to the HD aspect ratio. Manually set the white balance to 5600 or 5000K. Alternatively, you can use the daylight setting. In post you will be able to adjust the white balance in your LR time-lapse keyframes if required when you edit the keyframes in Lightroom. Set the ISO to 200 if you are starting your time-lapse well before sunset. If you are starting your time-lapse before dawn, set your ISO to the highest value you can, without introducing excessive noise into your images. Next, set the picture quality to RAW only. Setting it to RAW plus JPEG is a waste of space on your memory card, and more importantly, the camera will have to take additional time to process the JPEG image. This will become a problem when your shutter speed is nearly as long as the interval between shots. Always have your camera mode set to manual. It is also very important to set your camera focus to manual after you have used the autofocus to set your focus on a distant point at infinity, to reduce flicker. Make sure you have an empty, formatted memory card in the camera and several spares in your camera bag. In the GH4, a 64GB card has a capacity of 3139 raw images. Check your battery is fully charged and that you have several spares in your camera bag. For a late afternoon through to sunset sequence, set your shutter speed to a maximum speed of 1/30th of a second to create some motion blur with fast moving objects. ISO will be 200 or lower if your camera allows it, and the aperture would be around f/22. A variable density filter may be required to stay within these parameters if you start your time-lapse shoot earlier than late afternoon. For a pre-dawn to sunrise time-lapse, set your shutter speed to a minimum speed of 1.3 or 1.6 seconds, that is well within the 2-second shooting interval we will use. This is to ensure your camera has time to process on the RAW file to the card before the shutter is triggered again. Set the ISO for the pre-dawn shoot to 2000. Navigate to the time-lapse settings with your camera menu. You can set the time-lapse to start now when you press the shutter or program in a start time. Next you will set the shooting interval and image count. For airport scenes I use a 2 seconds interval due to the amount of movement. As you increase the image count, the end time below advances. Select set and you're ready to shoot your first time-lapse. Set your camera up on a sturdy tripod, making sure to keep the camera level. On the GH4 you rotate the dial to the time-lapse setting before pressing the shutter to initiate the time-lapse sequence. For the pre-dawn to sunrise time-lapse sequence, the camera settings for the first frame shot at 5:22 AM were aperture 6.3, shutter speed 0.6 seconds, and the ISO was set to 800. To compensate for the transition from pre-dawn to sunrise, the exposure and ISO will be gradually increased or ramped, by manually adjusting, by hand or with an application, either the aperture, shutter speed or ISO. On frame 135 shot at 5:26 AM the shutter speed was increased to 0.6 seconds. On frame 217 shot at 5:29 AM the shutter speed was increased to half a second. On frame 473 shot at 5:37 AM the shutter speed was increased to 0.4 seconds. On frame 539 shot at 5:40 AM the ISO was decreased to 640. From frame 667 and 669 onwards I adjusted the shutter speed and ISO quite frequently to keep pace with the rising sun and brighter lighting levels. Keep this up until you reach a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second and the minimum ISO of your particular camera. From this point onwards I started adjusting the aperture only. I have used the LR time-lapse application to create the Sydney Airport A380 aircraft time-lapse. First off, before opening the application ensure that Adobe Lightroom is open and in library mode. Launch the LR time-lapse application and select the Visual Workflow tab. In the lower left-hand panel navigate to the folder where you saved your time-lapse images. Note that in the trial version of LR time-lapse you are limited to a maximum of 400 images. Click on the Keyframes wizard once the images have loaded, which will automatically generate some keyframes. Keyframes are denoted by a blue diamonds on the yellow line. Scroll down the list of images to ensure you have at least 4 keyframe images. If you have a license for LR time-lapse and have over 400 images in your sequence, a dozen or more keyframes may be generated. Don't be too concerned about how your preview image appears at this stage in the camera preview window. The keyframe images can be post-processed in Lightroom several steps ahead, to create a far more pleasing result. If you use the Holy Grail exposure ramping technique described earlier to shoot your time-lapse images, the Holy Grail wizard button will be enabled. If the Holy Grail wizard tab is not visible, there is a problem with your sequence that you will need to resolve. Clicking on metadata and selecting Initialize Reset Metadata may resolve the issue. Click on the Holy Grail tab. A slider with a blue triangle will appear below that you can use to rotate the orange jagged line in order to make it more or less horizontal. Hit save and your workflow to date will be saved. Now click and drag the Drag to Lightroom tab into Lightroom and ensure the Add tab is active. Your time-lapse images will appear in Lightroom. Select Import in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen and wait for the images to load. This can take a while if your time-lapse sequence contains a lot of images. You will notice that the first image has a 4-star rating. This denotes a keyframe that was created by the Keyframe wizard. To reveal all the keyframes, click on Filters and select LRTS Keyframes. All the keyframes will load, which you can now edit in Lightroom's Develop module. Select the first keyframe and click on the Develop tab. In the basic adjustments, edit the image by reducing the highlights, lifting the shadows, increase the whites and adding some clarity. You can also use the linear tone curve to enhance your images. Do not use the non-linear adjustment brush, radial filter or graduated filter tools. Once you are happy with the result, shift-click the next image so that the first 2 images are now selected. Sync keyframes using the LR time-lapse script. The second image looks good, although we will adjust the white balance slightly. Shift-click to the third image and sync the keyframes using the LR time-lapse script. The third image look fine, although we should add some contrast to the foreground area. Use the tone cure to do this. Continue to shift-click to the next image and sync the keyframes using the LR time-lapse script, after you have made any edits you feel are necessary until you have edited and synced all the keyframe images. Once you have edited all the keyframe images, press the G key to enter Grid View in the Library tab, select all the keyframe images, click on Photo and save metadata to file. Return to LR time-lapse and click on Reload and Auto Transition. Next, click on the Visual Previews tab. A pink curve will be generated, which may be slightly jagged in places. When LR time-lapse completes this process, you can smooth out the curve using the Visual Deflicker tab. Adjust the slider to apply more smoothing and tick the multi-pass box. Select 2 and apply. In addition, you can refine the pink curve by clicking on the Refine tab. This process can take a while. To export your time-lapse video, open Lightroom, and in the filters select LRT's full sequence. Right-click on the first image and select Go to Folder in Library. Select all images and now go to the Metadata tab, and read metadata from files to get all changes from LR time-lapse into Lightroom. Select Export and choose LR time-lapse, LRT, JPG 4K. Fill in the file location details and hit Export. Once the export process is completed, the LR time-lapse application will present its render box. Leave the default settings as they are. Under the Post-Processing tab, you are able to select the area of the 4:3 frame that you wish to export as a high-definition video clip. Click on Render. The time-lapse video will appear in the folder you selected. Here is the rendered video. An extended video including the arrival of a further 2 A380 aircraft is available to view on a separate video. The link to this video will be placed below in the information section.